Everyone told me I had it easy. I laughed, then I cried, but not for long, not anymore. There is a certain liberating clarity that comes when you finally realize the person who brought you into this world views you as nothing more than a defective piece of luggage. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My mother, Lennox Reed, is a surgeon. She spends her days repairing shattered limbs and suturing skin with the precision of a master weaver. But she has spent 27 years treating my psyche like a specimen she forgot to preserve. I am Thatcher Reed, a graduate student with a high IQ and a bank account that usually smells like stale coffee and desperation. But today, the air in this room feels different. It smells like ozone and overdue accounts. The dining room was a gallery of unearned prestige. Crystal glasses caught the light of the chandelier, casting jagged diamonds across the silk tablecloth. Lennox sat at the head, her posture so rigid it suggested her spine had been replaced with a titanium rod. Across from her sat the usual suspects, distant cousins who smelled of expensive gin and boredom, and beside me, the empty space where my dignity used to sit during these family functions. "You look tired, Thatcher," Lennox said, her voice a polished blade. She didn't look up from her salad. "Graduate school seems to be aging you faster than it's educating you. Have you considered that perhaps your intellect isn't quite the match for the curriculum you've chosen?" I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, that sarcastic spark that usually stayed buried behind a polite nod. "I'm doing just fine, Mother. It's the research that's demanding, not the capacity to understand it." She finally looked at me, her eyes cold and clinical. "Capacity is irrelevant without results. I've spent a fortune ensuring you had every advantage. Private tutors, prep schools, the summer in Zurich. It was an investment, and yet here you are, 27 years old, still scraping by on a stipend while I maintain the Reed reputation." She set her fork down with a precise clink that silenced the rest of the table. "In fact, I've tallied it. The upbringing cost, as it were. If you aren't going to provide a return on my investment through success, I expect a literal one. I want you to start paying back the tuition for your private schooling. It's only fair." The cousins shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glued to their plates. This was her favorite sport, psychological dismantling. "You want me to pay you back for raising me?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. "I want you to take responsibility," she snapped. Her face tightened, the mask of the professional surgeon slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "I look at you and I see a vacuum, a waste of resources. Honestly, Thatcher, there are moments when I look across this table and I wish you never existed. It would have been much more efficient." The silence that followed was heavy, thick as tar. Most sons would have crumbled. Most would have walked out with tears in their eyes. But I just felt a strange electric click in my mind. The last thread of obligation snapped. "Then live as if I'm gone," I said. I stood up, my chair legs screeching against the hardwood floor. "Don't you walk away from this conversation," Lennox warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You owe me. You owe this family." "Actually," I said, reaching into my blazer pocket and pulling out a thick, cream-colored envelope. I didn't throw it. I placed it gently on the silk cloth, right next to her wine glass. "I think the accounting is a bit skewed. You've been so busy looking down at me that you forgot to look at the fine print of grandfather's estate." Lennox scoffed, but I saw the slight flicker in her pupils. "Your grandfather left everything in a managed trust. I am the executor." "You were the executor," I corrected her, leaning in so only she could hear the jagged edge of my triumph. "The trust was structured to vest entirely in the male heir upon his 27th birthday, provided he was enrolled in a terminal degree program. I turned 27 last Tuesday, Mother. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, the trust has been dissolved and the assets transferred." She reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the legal jargon, the signatures, and the seal of the city's most prestigious law firm. Her face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. This is the deed to the practice," she whispered. "The practice, the building it's housed in, and the land beneath your feet," I said, my voice rising so the whole table could hear. "You've spent years telling me I'm a guest in your life, a drain on your resources. But it turns out you're the one who's been living on my dime. That surgeon's suite you're so proud of? I own it. The equipment you use to fix those people? Mine. Even this house, Lennox. It's all part of the estate." "You can't do this," she stammered, the surgeon's poise completely shattered. "I built that practice." "You managed it," I said, walking toward the door. "And you managed it poorly. I've seen the audits. You've been skimming from the maintenance funds to pay for these ridiculous dinners. That ends tonight." I stopped at the heavy oak doors of the dining room and turned back. She was standing now, the legal documents clutched in her hand like a useless shield. The cousins were looking at her with a mix of horror and newfound judgment. The social hierarchy was shifting in real time, and she was sliding toward the bottom. By the way, I added, a sharp, sarcastic smile tugging at my lips, I've already filed the eviction notice for the medical practice. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. If you want to keep practicing medicine, I suggest you find a building I don't own, which, in this zip code, is going to be quite difficult. You won't, she started, her voice breaking. Watch me, I said. I walked out of the house and into the cool night air. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but it wasn't from fear. It was the rush of the hunt. This was only the beginning. My mother was the primary target, the architect of my misery, but she wasn't the only one who had feasted on my downfall. I climbed into my beat-up sedan, the engine groaning as it turned over. I pulled a small notebook from the glove box. On the first page, 4 names were written in precise black ink. Lennox Reed, Daniel Price, Clara Summers, Robert Finch. Lennox was already reeling, but she was a fighter. She would try to move her equipment, try to leverage her contacts, try to sell the practice out from under me before the paperwork was fully processed. She didn't realize I had already changed the security codes. I drove away from the estate, heading toward the neon-drenched heart of the city. I needed to move fast. Daniel and Clara were next. Danielle, my best friend from the lab, the man who had whispered in my ear about a partnership while simultaneously BCCing our department head on every private draft of my thesis. And Clara, the woman I had shared my life with, who had shared my proprietary data with Daniel over expensive dinners I was paying for. They thought I was the smart, harmless underdog. They thought I was the guy who took the hits and came back for more because I didn't know any better. They were about to learn that when you push a logical man to his limit, he doesn't just push back, he reconfigures the entire map so you have nowhere left to stand. I parked 3 blocks away from the downtown cafe where I knew Daniel and Clara met every Thursday. It was a trendy spot with floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place people go when they want to be seen being successful. I pulled my hood up and sat in the shadows of a doorway across the street, watching. Through the glass, I saw them. Daniel was laughing, gesturing wildly with a glass of sparkling water. Clara was leaning in, her smile bright and artificial. They looked perfect. They looked like they had won. I felt a surge of cold, calculating energy. I didn't want to hurt them physically. That was beneath me. I wanted to dismantle their lives until they were as hollow as they had tried to make mine. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, handheld device I'd spent the last 3 nights assembling in the university workshop. It wasn't a weapon. It was a signal jammer tuned specifically to the frequency of high-end European car fobs. Daniel's pride and joy, a silver sports car, was parked right at the curb. I waited. When they stood up to leave, I stepped further into the shadows. They walked out of the cafe, still laughing, Daniel reaching into his pocket for his keys. He pressed the button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, more frantically this time. He walked right up to the door, clicking the fob like a shuddering heartbeat. From my vantage point, I saw the frustration boil over. Clara said something sharp, pointing at the car. Daniel kicked the tire, a childish, pathetic gesture. I smiled. It was a small inconvenience, a tiny crack in the windshield of his perfect life, but I was going to keep tapping on that glass until it shattered. As they began to look around, Daniel's eyes swept across the street. For a second, our gazes almost locked. I turned and moved quickly down the alleyway. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. "Hey, you!" Daniel's voice echoed off the brick walls. I didn't run. I moved with a practiced, athletic grace, weaving through the labyrinth of back streets I had mapped out days ago. I turned a corner, vaulted over a low gate, and vanished into the darkness of an abandoned loading dock. I heard him huffing, his expensive shoes slapping against the pavement, but he was slow and soft. I watched from the shadows as he reached the mouth of the alley, looking left and right, his face red with exertion and confusion. He looked diminished. I let out a low, breathy laugh that he couldn't possibly hear. The game was afoot, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the controller. I headed toward my temporary apartment, a small, nameless place that no one in my former life knew about. I had work to do. Bobby Finch was still out there, feeling secure in his luxury office, and my mother was currently realizing that her world was locked behind a door she no longer had the key to. Tonight, the underdog had teeth, and I was very, very hungry. The ceiling of my temporary apartment was a map of water stains and peeling plaster, a stark contrast to the crown molding of the Reed estate. I lay on the narrow cot, staring upward, my mind a humming hive of variables and timelines. My internal monologue, usually a cacophony of self-doubt, had settled into a sharp, sarcastic rhythm. I felt like a grandmaster who had finally stopped playing against himself and started looking at the opponent's weaknesses. Lennox, Daniel, Clara, and Bobby. They were all figures on a board, and I had just removed the floor beneath their feet. I rose at dawn, the air in the room crisp and smelling of old paper. My laptop sat on a repurposed crate, its screen glowing with the digital footprints of my former friends. Investigation is a tedious process for those without patience, but for me, it was a form of meditation. I spent the morning digging through the metadata of the research papers Daniel had published over the last year. It was all there, hidden in the properties of the files, timestamps that matched my own lab sessions, phrasing that mirrored my private journals, and a specific coding error I had made and corrected in my own drafts, but which Daniel had copied verbatim. He wasn't just a thief, he was a sloppy one. He relied on the assumption that I would never check, that I was too beaten down by my mother's shadow to ever look up. By noon, I moved to Clara. She was more careful, but her vanity was her undoing. She loved the social capital of being in the know. I found a series of encrypted messages on a shared cloud drive we'd forgotten to disconnect. She had been leaking my proprietary data to Daniel in exchange for introductions to high-tier venture capitalists. They weren't just stepping on me to get ahead, they were using my ribs as a ladder. I felt a cold, dry amusement. I didn't feel the urge to scream or throw things. That was Lennox's way. Explosive, dramatic, messy. My way was surgical. I dressed in a nondescript gray hoodie and heavy work pants, slipping a specialized toolkit into my pocket. It was time for a bit of reconnaissance and a few minor adjustments to their reality. I spent the afternoon shadowed in a parked van near the university's research annex. I watched Daniel emerge from the building, looking frazzled. His silver sports car was gone, likely towed after the previous night's electronics failure, and he was currently hailing a rideshare with the frantic energy of a man who realized his schedule was no longer his own. I followed the car at a distance. He didn't go back to the lab. He went to Clara's apartment, a glass-fronted luxury high-rise that screamed of unearned income. I waited until I saw them together on her balcony, clutching glasses of sparkling cider and looking out over the city. They looked like they were plotting their next move. I pulled out a long-range microphone and tuned it to the glass. "He can't actually own the building, Daniel." Clara's voice crackled through my earpiece, thin and strained. Lennox would have known. She's a surgeon. She's not stupid. "She's blindsided, Clara," Daniel replied, his voice shaking. "I saw the paperwork. It looked legitimate. If Thatcher pulls the rug out from the practice, our funding for the biotech project is tied to that clinical space. We lose the lab, we lose the grant." "Then we make him look unstable," Clara said, her tone hardening. "We have the records of his outbursts. We can say he forged the documents. Who are they going to believe? The brilliant doctor and her successful associates, or the graduate student who can't even afford a decent haircut?" I switched off the receiver. It was a predictable move. They were going to try to gaslight the legal system. I checked my watch. It was time to introduce a little chaos into their afternoon. While they were occupied on the balcony, I moved to the rear of the building. I knew the layout from the months I'd spent visiting Clara when I thought we were building a future. I accessed the external utility room, a feat made easy by the fact that the building manager used the default factory codes for the security keypad. I found the riser for the 4th floor, Clara's floor. I wasn't going to do anything dangerous. I simply located the main intake for the automated fire suppression system and the central HVAC unit. With a few turns of a wrench and the application of a high-pressure canister of industrial-strength expanding foam I'd modified, I created a very specific problem. I injected the foam into the drainage lines and the secondary overflow valves. Then, I bypassed the sensor on the humidification system, forcing it to run at maximum capacity. Within hours, the humidity in her apartment would rise to the level of a tropical rainforest, and the blocked drains would ensure that any moisture had nowhere to go but out through the vents and into her expensive electronics. It was a slow-motion disaster, a physical manifestation of the rot they'd introduced into my life. I moved on to my next stop, the corporate offices of Finch and Associates. Bobby Finch was a different breed of betrayer. He hadn't stolen my research, he had stolen my reputation. He was the mentor who had recommended me for 3 different fellowships, only to call the chairs of those committees privately to warn them that I was brilliant but emotionally volatile. He wanted to keep me under his thumb, a secret weapon he could use to ghostwrite his own papers without ever having to worry about me becoming a rival. The office was a fortress of glass and polished stone. I didn't try to go inside. Instead, I waited in the underground parking garage. I knew Bobby's routine. He left at exactly 6:30 p.m. to go to his gym. As his black sedan pulled out, I followed him, not to the gym, but to his satellite office, a smaller, less secure space he used for his private consulting work. I watched from a distance as he entered. I used a high-powered lens to observe him through the window. He sat at his desk, opening a safe and pulling out a ledger. My heart skipped a beat, a rhythmic thrum of anticipation. That ledger wasn't for his medical consulting. It was for the financial manipulation I'd suspected but could never prove. He was moving money between accounts, money that belonged to the Reed estate. He wasn't just sabotaging my career, he was actively looting my inheritance to fund his own failing ventures. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. He felt so secure in my perceived weakness that he was doing his dirty work in a room with the blinds open. I took a series of high-resolution photos, the shutter of the camera a quiet, rhythmic click that felt like a countdown. Suddenly, a security patrol vehicle turned the corner of the lot. I ducked low, my pulse quickening. This was the adrenaline-focused reality of my new life. I wasn't a student anymore. I was a ghost in the machine. I stayed perfectly still, the shadows of the van concealing me as the patrol's lights swept over the area. When the tail lights faded, I let out a slow, controlled breath. I had enough. I had the evidence of Bobby's fraud, the proof of Daniel's plagiarism, and I had already initiated the physical breakdown of Clara's environment. But as I sat there, a new realization began to settle in my mind. This wasn't just about 3 people. It all led back to Lennox. She hadn't just been a cold mother. She had been the coordinator. She had given Daniel the drafts. She had introduced Clara to the VCs. She had even authorized Bobby to manage the trust funds that he was now stealing. She had tried to dismantle me from the inside out, using every person I trusted as a tool to ensure I would never be strong enough to challenge her. The sarcasm that usually shielded my emotions wavered for a moment, replaced by a simmering, focused fury. I didn't need to touch them. I didn't need to raise my hand in a physical confrontation. I just needed to pull the strings I had already attached to their lives. I drove back to my hideout, the city lights blurring into long streaks of gold and red. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I began to draft the messages. Not threats, just observations. An anonymous email to Daniel with a screenshot of the metadata from his latest paper. A text to Clara with a picture of the moisture-damaged servers in her building's basement. And for Bobby, a single photo of his open ledger, sent from a burner phone. I sat back, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes. I could almost feel the panic radiating from them across the city. They would spend the night wondering who was watching, who knew their secrets, and how much ground they had already lost. The cliffhanger wasn't for me, it was for them. They were hanging over the edge of a reputation they had built on lies, and I was the only one holding the rope. I reached for a glass of water, my hand perfectly steady. Tomorrow, the eviction at the medical practice would go into effect. Lennox would arrive at her sanctuary only to find the locks changed and the power cut. She would finally understand that the vacuum she saw in me was actually a space I had been saving. For her. I closed the laptop and lay back on the cot. The water stain on the ceiling looked a bit like a map of a territory I now owned. I closed my eyes, a small, sarcastic smile playing on my lips. I didn't need a comfortable bed to sleep well. I just needed to know that, somewhere out there, the people who had tried to break me were staring at their own ceilings, wondering when the next blow would fall. The walls were closing in, just as I'd planned, and I was the one who had built the walls. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of ozone and damp pavement as I stood across the street from the Reed medical practice. It was exactly 8 a.m. In the world of Lennox Reed, punctuality was next to godliness, a trait she had hammered into me with the persistence of a sculptor working a stubborn piece of granite. I watched from the safety of a nearby coffee shop window, sipping a brew that tasted like burnt beans and triumph. Lennox pulled up in her slate gray sedan, a vehicle that cost more than my entire education and looked twice as predatory. She stepped out, her white lab coat draped over her arm like a ceremonial robe. She marched toward the glass double doors with the confidence of a queen returning to her throne. She reached for the handle, pulled, and stopped. The doors didn't budge. She frowned, a minor crease appearing on her otherwise flawless forehead, and swiped her keycard. The reader emitted a sharp red flash and a flat mechanical rejection tone. I leaned back in my chair, the plastic creaking under my weight. I could almost hear her internal monologue, the mounting irritation, the refusal to believe that a piece of technology would dare to defy her. She swiped again. Faster. Harder. Then she began to pound on the glass, her reflection distorted by the heavy tint. She looked small, a frantic moth beating its wings against a jar. She didn't know that inside. The servers had been wiped, the patient files encrypted behind a wall of my own design, and the power grid scheduled for a maintenance blackout that would last until I decided otherwise. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Daniel. Thatcher, we need to talk. Something is happening with the car and the lab access. Clara's apartment is a mess. Call me. I ignored it. The silence was my most potent weapon. I wanted them to stew in the uncertainty, to let their own imaginations construct the monsters that were coming for them. I finished my coffee and slipped out the back exit, moving through the alleyways toward the university. The campus was a labyrinth of brick and ivy, a place where I had spent years being the quiet, reliable assistant. Today, I was a ghost. I navigated the basement corridors of the engineering building, avoiding the security cameras I had mapped out weeks ago. My target was Daniel's primary workstation. He had stolen my research, but he hadn't changed the underlying architecture of the simulations. He was too lazy for that. I slipped into the lab. The hum of the cooling fans was the only sound in the sterile room. I sat at his desk, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I wasn't going to delete his work. That would be too simple, too easy for him to explain away as a technical glitch. Instead, I introduced a subtle, catastrophic error into the core algorithm. A mathematical ghost that would produce perfectly logical results until the very moment of a live demonstration. It was a ticking clock of professional humiliation. As I finished, the door handle turned. I dove beneath the long lab bench, my heart drumming a steady, rhythmic cadence against my ribs. It wasn't the frantic thumping of a victim. It was the measured pulse of a predator. "I'm telling you, it's him," Clara's voice echoed in the room. She sounded frayed, the usual silkiness of her tone replaced by a jagged edge. The sprinklers went off for 3 seconds, just long enough to soak the server rack in the closet. The building manager says there was no system failure. It was manual. "He doesn't have the guts, Clara," Daniel spat. I could see his expensive leather shoes pacing back and forth just inches from my hiding spot. "Thatcher is a coward. He's always been a coward. Lennox broke him years ago. This is probably some elaborate prank, or maybe we're just having a run of bad luck." "Bad luck doesn't lock your mother out of her own office, Daniel. I saw her in the parking lot. She was screaming at a security guard. He told her the building had been sold to a private holding company, and her lease was terminated effective immediately." Daniel stopped pacing. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that their safety net was unraveling. "A holding company? Which one?" "Something called TR Management. Does that sound like a prank to you?" I smiled in the dark. TR, Thatcher Reed. I wasn't even trying to hide it, yet they still couldn't wrap their minds around the idea of me taking charge. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they were looking for a titan when the person dismantling them was right under their feet. "We have to find him," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate hiss. "If he has the deed, we need to negotiate. We can offer him a cut of the grant. He's always been desperate for approval. We just play on that." They left the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. I waited a full minute before sliding out from under the bench. Negotiate? The time for negotiation had ended the moment they decided my life was a commodity to be traded for their own advancement. I spent the next several hours on the move. I was a shadow in the city, a phantom in the machine. I visited the bank where Bobby Finch kept his private safety deposit box, not to break in, but to hand-deliver a legal injunction I had prepared with the help of a disgruntled paralegal I'd befriended months ago. The injunction froze any transfer of assets related to the Reed estate pending a full forensic audit. By sunset, I was perched on the rooftop of a parking garage overlooking the city's central plaza. Below, the lights were beginning to flicker on, creating a shimmering grid of gold and blue. I watched as Daniel's silver car, now back in his possession after a costly emergency repair, idled at a red light. I pulled a small remote from my pocket. It was a simple device, a radio frequency interceptor I'd built for a junior-level electronics project. I waited until the light turned green. As Daniel accelerated, I pressed the button. The car's horn began to blare in a continuous, deafening shriek. The hazard lights flashed in a frantic, strobe-like pattern. The power lock cycled rapidly, click-clack, click-clack, trapping him inside as the vehicle's anti-theft system went into a full, panicked meltdown. People on the sidewalk stopped to stare. Daniel was visible through the windshield, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple as he struggled with the controls, his mouth moving in silent, frustrated curses. It was a public spectacle, a masterpiece of social embarrassment. He wasn't in danger, but he was exposed. He was a man who lived for his image, and right now, that image was a screaming, blinking mess in the middle of rush-hour traffic. I didn't stay to watch the end. I had a more important appointment. I arrived at Clara's apartment building just as the evening fog began to roll in from the harbor. I didn't go to the front door. Instead, I used the service elevator, wearing a maintenance jumpsuit I'd acquired from the basement. I reached the 4th floor and moved silently down the hallway. I found the main water shutoff valve for her unit, located in a small closet in the hall. I didn't turn it off. Instead, I attached a small, vibrating motor to the pipe, a device used in industrial settings to prevent clogs, but when tuned to a specific frequency, it created a low-pitched, persistent hum that resonated through the walls. It was the kind of sound that you couldn't quite pinpoint, but which would eventually drive a person to the brink of a nervous breakdown. It was the sound of a house that was no longer a home. As I was leaving, the elevator doors opened. It was Clara. She looked exhausted, her hair damp from the humidified nightmare I'd created earlier. She didn't see me in the shadows of the utility closet. She walked toward her door, her shoulders slumped. "I know you're here, Thatcher," she whispered into the empty hallway. I held my breath, my back pressed against the cold metal of the pipe. "I know it's you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not funny anymore. Just tell us what you want. Please." I felt a brief flicker of something. Not guilt, but a cold sort of satisfaction. She wanted a target. She wanted a confrontation she could manage, a scene she could script. But I wasn't giving her that. I was giving her the one thing she couldn't handle: the unknown. I waited until she went inside, and I heard the heavy thud of her deadbolt. Then I stepped out into the hallway. I pulled a small, white envelope from my pocket and slid it under her door. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of the two of them, Daniel and Clara, sitting on her balcony the night before, taken from my vantage point with the long-range lens. On the back, I had written a single sentence in my most precise academic script: "The view is better from over here." I took the stairs down, my boots echoing in the concrete stairwell. The escalation was reaching its peak. I had disrupted their finances, their professional lives, and their personal sanctuaries. They were isolated, paranoid, and turning on each other. But the final act was still to come. Lennox was the heart of the rot, the source of the infection. She was a woman who defined herself by her power, her control, and her reputation. I had taken her practice and her building, but she still had her name. She still had the belief that she was untouchable. I walked out into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting in my eyes. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a sarcastic inner monologue that was no longer a defense mechanism, but a victory lap. They thought they had buried me, but they had forgotten that I was the one who knew where all the shovels were kept. The walls weren't just closing in, they were becoming a cage, and I was the one with the only set of keys. As I walked toward my car, I saw a black sedan idling at the end of the block. The headlights flicked on, blinding me for a second. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, my hands in my pockets, a small, knowing smile on my face. The hunter was becoming the hunted, but the hunter had a few more tricks up his sleeve. "Would you like to see what happens next?" I whispered to the empty street. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt, and the real chase began. The black sedan didn't charge. It loomed. It was a predatory piece of German engineering that I recognized as Bobby Finch's personal transport, a car that whispered of executive boardrooms and quiet, professional erasures. As the headlights cut through the fog, I didn't scramble for the alleyways. I simply stood my ground, my silhouette cast long and thin against the wet pavement. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to record the image of the man they had dismissed as a footnote, finally writing the ending of their story. The car swerved at the last moment, the tires spraying a fine mist of rainwater over my boots, and vanished into the city's concrete throat. It wasn't an attempt at a collision, it was a reminder. They were watching back now. The game had finally become symmetrical. I spent the following morning in the sanctuary of a public library, the kind of place where the silence is enforced by social contract and the scent of aging paper provides a veneer of stability. I wasn't there to read. I was there to orchestrate the public dismantling of Robert Bobby Finch. Bobby was scheduled to give the keynote address at the annual Medical Innovation Summit, a high-stakes gathering of investors, researchers, and the very venture capitalists Clara had been courting. It was the perfect stage. Bobby's presentation was stored on a secure cloud server, protected by layers of encryption that would have stopped a casual observer. But Bobby had a weakness I had exploited months ago during my time as his assistant. He used the same alphanumeric sequence for everything, the date of his first successful surgery followed by the initials of the prestigious hospital that had fired him 20 years ago for administrative irregularities. It was a classic case of ego overriding security. I accessed his slide deck. It was a masterpiece of professional theft. He had taken my theoretical models on neural mapping and rebranded them as his own Finch method. I didn't delete the slides. Instead, I inserted a series of hidden layers. Using a simple script, I set the presentation to auto-transition every 30 seconds to a scanned image of the ledger I had photographed in his satellite office. Every time he spoke about ethical innovation, the screen behind him would show a line item of the funds he had diverted from the Reed Trust into his offshore accounts. It was a digital trapdoor, timed to open when the room was at its fullest. By 2 p.m., I was at the convention center, blending into the crowd of navy blazers and sensible heels. I wore a pair of thick-rimmed glasses and carried a tablet, looking every bit the diligent researcher. The energy in the room was electric, a collective hum of ambition and expensive cologne. I saw Clara and Daniel in the second row, their faces tight, their eyes darting around the room as if they expected the walls to start speaking. They looked like they hadn't slept in 48 hours. The humidity in Clara's apartment and the auditory torture I'd installed had clearly done their work. Bobby took the stage to a polite ripple of applause. He looked magnificent. Silver hair perfectly coiffed, a suit that cost more than my car, and a smile that suggested he had never told a lie in his life. Innovation, Bobby began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone, is not just about the discovery. It is about the stewardship of the future. I leaned against the back wall, my thumb hovering over the execute command on my tablet. I waited until he reached slide 5, the one where he began to explain the Finch method. Our approach to neural mapping requires a level of transparency that... He stopped. The screen behind him had flickered. Instead of a complex diagram of a brain, the audience was now staring at a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer receipt. It showed $50,000 moving from the Reed Medical Trust to an account titled Finch Consulting, LLC. A murmur rippled through the audience. Bobby turned, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered. It seems we have a slight technical glitch. If the AV team could? The screen transitioned again. This time, it was a photograph of Bobby's own handwritten ledger, the one detailing the administrative fees he had been charging Lennox for reputation management. The numbers were staggering. "What is this?" someone shouted from the front row. It was one of the primary investors. I didn't wait to see the fallout. I turned and walked out of the auditorium, the sound of Bobby's stammering excuses fading behind me. As I reached the lobby, I saw Lennox. She was standing by the fountain, her face a mask of frozen fury. She wasn't looking at the screens, she was looking at me. She had followed me there. "Thatcher," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss that cut through the ambient noise of the convention center. "You've made a very expensive mistake." "I think the accounting is finally starting to balance, Mother," I replied, my tone airy and sarcastic. Bobby's career just hit a permanent plateau. I imagine the board of directors will have some very pointed questions about where that trust money went. She stepped closer, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the sterile air of the lobby. "You think you're being clever. You think this is some grand victory. But all you've done is ensure that the Reed name is dragged through the mud along with his. You're destroying your own legacy." "It was never my legacy, Lennox. It was your cage. I'm just taking the bars down." She reached out as if to grab my arm, but I stepped back, my movements fluid and controlled. "I'm not that boy who sat at your dinner table and took the insults anymore. I'm the landlord now, and I believe your 48 hours are nearly up." The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion coming from the auditorium. The doors burst open, and a swarm of frustrated investors and reporters spilled out. In the chaos, I saw Daniel and Clara trying to make a discreet exit. They spotted me and Lennox, and for a moment, the four of us formed a tense, silent square in the middle of the lobby. Daniel looked like he was on the verge of a physical collapse. "Thatcher, stop this. We can fix the data. We can give you the credit you want." "I don't want the credit, Daniel," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "I want the truth. And the truth is that you're a mediocre scientist who thought he could steal his way to the top. Clara, I hope the apartment is drying out. I hear mold can be quite difficult to remove from high-end electronics." Clara's face went pale. "You're a monster." "No," I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "I'm a graduate student who finally finished his thesis. The subject was the structural integrity of betrayal. It turns out it's remarkably fragile." Suddenly, Bobby Finch emerged from the crowd, his face a mottled shade of red, his tie loosened. He looked around the lobby, his eyes landing on me with a focused, desperate intensity. He didn't say a word. He just started walking toward me, his pace quickening. The chase was back on. I turned and bolted toward the glass exit doors, my heart rate accelerating in a sharp, invigorating spike. I burst out into the afternoon sunlight, weaving through the crowded plaza. I could hear them behind me, Daniel's heavy breathing, Bobby's frantic shouts, the clicking of Clara's heels on the pavement. They were pursuing me like a pack of hounds, but I was the one who had mapped the terrain. I headed for the downtown subway entrance, leaping over a turnstile and disappearing into the subterranean depths. I didn't take a train. I moved through the service tunnels, a world of damp concrete and humming electrical conduits that I had studied on the city's municipal blueprints. I could hear their voices echoing in the tunnels, distorted by the acoustics of the underground. "He went this way," Daniel's voice rang out. followed by the clatter of feet on metal stairs. I climbed a vertical ladder leading to a sidewalk grate 3 blocks away. I emerged in a quiet side street, gasping for air but feeling a triumphant rush of adrenaline. I looked back at the convention center, which loomed in the distance like a sinking ship. The multi-layered revenge was working. Bobby was professionally ruined. Daniel and Clara were terrified and exposed. And Lennox was realizing that her world was no longer under her control. But as I walked toward my car, a new thought entered my mind. A dark, sarcastic whisper that reminded me I hadn't yet looked at the biggest secret of all. Lennox hadn't just been stealing from the trust. She had been hiding something in the medical practice's basement, something that went beyond financial manipulation. During my brief time looking at the digital logs before I locked her out, I had seen a series of encrypted files labeled Legacy Project. They weren't patient records, they were research files. Research that looked suspiciously like my own, but dated 10 years ago. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just been belittling my intellect, she had been suppressing it. She had seen my potential early on and had spent a decade making sure I never realized it, all while using my early observations to bolster her own career. I sat in my car, the engine idling, the city lights beginning to blur as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cliffhanger wasn't just about their ruin, it was about the origin of the rot. I needed to get into that basement. I needed to see what the Legacy Project really was. I pulled out my phone and sent a final message to the group chat I had created with their numbers, the one they couldn't leave because I had blocked their ability to exit. The basement door is still unlocked, Mother, but the cameras are on. See you at the finish line. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb. The walls weren't just closing in on them, the floor was about to drop out, and I was going to be there to watch the fall. The night was a vast, bruised expanse of purple and charcoal, illuminated by the nervous flickering of city lights that looked like failing neurons. I sat in my car outside the Reed medical practice, the engine silent, the dashboard lights dimmed to a ghostly glow. This was the structure that had defined my family's mythos, a temple of surgical precision and social standing. Now, it was a dark monolith of glass and steel, and I held the only working digital key in the world. I checked my watch. The eviction period had officially passed 3 hours ago. Legally, anything left inside was mine. Emotionally, it had always been a prison, and I was here to finally burn the records of my incarceration. I stepped out of the car, the cool air biting at my neck. I moved toward the side entrance, the one used by the janitorial staff and the delivery couriers. My fingers moved over the keypad with a practiced, rhythmic certainty. The lock clicked, a heavy, metallic sound that echoed in the empty alleyway. I stepped inside, the air smelling of antiseptic and the dry, recycled breath of a building without its inhabitants. The silence was absolute, yet it felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the final act of this domestic theater. I made my way toward the central administrative hub. I didn't need a flashlight. I knew these corridors better than the lines on my own palm. I had spent my childhood hiding in these offices, reading textbooks while my mother performed her miracles in the operating theaters upstairs. I reached the main terminal and slid into the ergonomic chair that Lennox had occupied for 20 years. I felt a surge of sarcastic amusement. The seat was too high for me, adjusted for her rigid, demanding posture. I lowered it until my feet were planted firmly on the floor. With a few keystrokes, I initiated the final stage of the financial takeover. I had already diverted the practice's operational accounts into the trust, but now I was executing the transfer of the physical assets. Every piece of high-end surgical equipment, every laser scalpel, and every diagnostic array was being listed for immediate private auction to Lennox's biggest professional rivals. I watched the progress bars crawl across the screen, a digital liquidation of her life's work. It was efficient, it was clean, it was exactly the kind of professional detachment she had always praised in me, though she never expected it to be turned against her. Then I turned my attention to the Legacy Project. The files were buried deep within a secondary partition, hidden behind a biometric wall that I had bypassed using a high-resolution scan of Lennox's thumbprint, an image I'd lifted from a discarded wine glass at that final, disastrous dinner. As the folders opened, the true scale of her betrayal crystallized. It wasn't just research. It was a comprehensive archive of my cognitive development. There were notes from when I was 10, 12, 15, observations on my spatial reasoning, my mathematical aptitude, and my linguistic patterns. She hadn't just been a mother, she had been a parasite. She had taken my childhood insights into neural plasticity, ideas I had babbled about over breakfast, and refined them into the papers that had made her a star in the surgical world. She had systematically discouraged my confidence so that I would never look closely enough at her work to see my own fingerprints all over it. She had kept me small so she could remain a giant A sharp, metallic clang echoed from the floor below. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. Someone was in the basement. I checked the internal security feed on my tablet. The resolution was grainy, the night vision casting everything in a surreal, luminous green. I saw 3 figures moving through the storage area. Lennox, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. Daniel, looking like a man who had lost his way in a storm. And Bobby Finch, his suit rumpled, his face a mask of desperation. They were trying to reach the physical backup servers, thinking they could still delete the evidence of their fraud before the morning sun exposed them. I didn't call the police. That would be too quick, too merciful. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in. I reached for the building's integrated control system and began to play with the environment. In the basement, the overhead lights began to strobe. Not a fast, chaotic flash, but a slow, deliberate pulse, like a dying star. I activated the high-frequency alarms in the diagnostic suites, a piercing, rhythmic whistle that would make it impossible to think or speak. I watched on the monitor as Daniel covered his ears, his mouth open in a silent shout. Lennox was at the server door, pulling at a handle that I had electronically jammed. I leaned into the intercom microphone. "It's a bit late for a house call, don't you think?" My voice boomed through the basement speakers, distorted and magnified by the acoustics of the concrete walls. The 3 of them jumped, spinning around to look at the security cameras. Lennox stared directly into the lens, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a flickering, residual arrogance. "Thatcher!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the sirens. "Open this door. You are interfering with medical property. You will be ruined for this." "I'm already ruined, Lennox," I said, my voice calm and conversational. "You spent 27 years making sure of that. I'm just returning the favor. By the way, the auction for your surgical suite just went live. Dr. Sterling from the General Hospital just outbid the others. He's very excited to move into your office on Monday." Lennox's knees seemed to buckle. She slumped against the server door, her white coat dragging against the dirty floor. Daniel was pacing like a caged animal, his eyes darting toward the exits. Bobby Finch was trying to use a heavy metal equipment cart to ram the door, his movements clumsy and ineffective. I watched them for a long time, a silent observer of their disintegration. It was a study in human frailty. These were the people who had dictated the terms of my existence, who had stolen my ideas and mocked my ambitions. Now they were trapped in a basement, fighting against a door that wouldn't open, in a building they no longer owned. I stood up from the desk. It was time for the final confrontation. I took the service elevator down to the basement level, the mechanical hum of the cables the only sound in the shaft. When the doors opened, the noise of the sirens was deafening. I stepped out into the hallway, the strobing lights making the world feel like a series of disconnected still frames. I walked toward the server room. Bobby saw me first. He dropped the metal cart and lunged toward me, but he was slow, his balance compromised by the flashing lights. I stepped aside with a fluid motion, letting his own momentum carry him into a stack of empty crates. He tumbled to the floor, groaning as he clutched his shoulder. Daniel backed away, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Thatcher, please. We can talk about this. I'll give you everything. I'll retract the papers. I'll tell the board it was all you." "You'll do that anyway, Daniel," I said, raising my voice to be heard. "Because if you don't, I'll release the chat logs of you and Clara discussing how to salt my lab samples. I found those this morning. You really should be more careful with your cloud backups." I turned my gaze to Lennox. She had stood up, trying to regain some semblance of her former dignity, but her hair was disheveled and her eyes were hollow. "You think you've won," she hissed, her voice trembling. "But you're just like me. Look at what you're doing. The manipulation, the planning. You're my son, Thatcher. This is my legacy." "No," I said, stepping into the circle of her space. I felt no heat, no anger, just a vast, cool distance. "This isn't your legacy. This is my graduation. You taught me how to be a surgeon of people's lives, Lennox. You taught me how to find the weak spot and apply the pressure. I'm just the first person to use those skills on a worthy patient." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, physical key, the manual override for the server room. I held it up so she could see it. For a moment, a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. Then I turned and walked toward the heavy industrial shredder located near the loading dock. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. I dropped the key into the intake. The machine roared to life, a grinding, mechanical growl that ended in a sharp snap as the metal was obliterated. "The digital locks are permanent now," I said. "The files, the research, the legacy project, it's all being encrypted into a loop. It'll take 20 years to crack that code. By then, none of you will remember what it was like to be important." The sirens suddenly cut out, replaced by an even more oppressive silence. The strobe lights stopped, leaving us in the dim, steady glow of the emergency lanterns. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing with a finality that felt like a closing curtain. "You can stay here until the morning," I said, looking back over my shoulder. "The security team will be here at 6 to escort you out. I've already authorized them to use whatever force is necessary to ensure the property is vacated. I suggest you spend the time reflecting on your investments." I stepped through the exit door and out into the night. The city air felt incredibly sweet, a sharp contrast to the stale atmosphere of the practice. I walked toward my car, my mind already moving toward the final resolution. There were still a few loose ends. Clara was likely waiting at her ruined apartment, and there were legal documents that needed my final signature, but the weight that had been on my chest for a lifetime was gone. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw a flashing blue light in my rearview mirror. Not a police car, a security patrol. They were right on time. The perimeter was being established. The cage was sealed. I turned onto the main road, the engine of my sedan humming a smooth, confident note. I felt a sarcastic laugh bubble up in my throat, a sound of genuine, unadulterated victory. They had tried to make me a ghost in my own life, but I had turned the world into their haunting ground. I reached for my phone and deleted the names from my notebook, one by one. There was only one thing left to do: vanish. But before I did, I wanted to see the look on Clara's face when she realized that even her silence had been bought and sold. The climax was building, the tension a tight cord ready to snap. I shifted into high gear, the city lights a blur of triumph as I headed toward the final showdown. The final morning arrived not with a roar, but with the quiet, clinical precision of a scalpel. I sat on a park bench across from the high-rise that housed Clara's ruined sanctuary, watching the sun crest over the skyline. My internal monologue, once a frantic mess of resentment, had settled into a steady, rhythmic hum. I felt like a watchmaker observing the final gears of a complex mechanism click into place. Every movement I had made over the last week was an investment, and today was the day the dividends were paid in full. I checked my tablet. The digital auctions for the Reed Medical Practice's equipment had concluded at 5 now a.m. The assets had been distributed among 4 different competing networks, effectively vaporizing Lennox's professional footprint in the city. Her reputation, her equipment, and her real estate were now scattered fragments of a former empire. I sent a final command to the server loop. The legacy project files were now encrypted with a rotating key that would change every hour based on a sequence of prime numbers known only to me. It was a digital vault buried in a trench. I saw Clara emerge from the lobby of her building. She wasn't the polished, vibrant woman I had once admired. She looked small, wrapped in an oversized coat, her eyes red-rimmed and scanning the street with a frantic, animalistic energy. She was carrying a single suitcase, likely filled with whatever clothes hadn't been ruined by the humidity and the dampness of her apartment. She didn't have a car anymore. I had ensured her lease was flagged for a fraudulent insurance claim based on the moisture damage I'd orchestrated. She was waiting for a bus. I stood up and walked toward her. I didn't hide. I didn't need the shadows anymore. When she saw me approaching, she froze, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the handle of her luggage. "You've taken everything," she whispered as I stopped a few feet away. The street noise of the waking city seemed to dampen around us, creating a bubble of intense, quiet confrontation. "Are you satisfied now, Thatcher? I have no job, no apartment, and Daniel is currently being questioned by the university board. Is this the victory you wanted?" "Victory is a loud word, Clara," I said, my voice conversational and light. "I prefer the term restoration. You took my work, my trust, and my time. I simply took back the value of those assets. You're not a victim, you're a liquidated account." "You used to be kind," she said, a desperate attempt at emotional manipulation that fell flat against the wall of my resolve. "I used to be quiet," I corrected her. "There's a difference. I hope you enjoy the bus ride. I hear the regional lines are very reliable for people starting over from scratch." I turned away before she could respond. I didn't need her tears or her apologies. They were as artificial as the smile she'd used when she was stealing my research. I had one final stop to make before the city became a memory in my rearview mirror. The Reed estate was silent when I arrived. The gates were open, a sign that the security detail I'd hired had already completed the first phase of the handover. I walked up the marble steps, the heels of my boots echoing with a triumphant, hollow sound. I found Lennox in the study, sitting behind her mahogany desk. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was staring at a stack of legal documents, the official notice of the trust dissolution and the eviction from this very house. "The movers will be here at noon, Lennox," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I've arranged for your personal effects to be delivered to a small apartment in the suburbs. It's modest, but it's more than you ever offered me when I was struggling." She looked up, her face a map of exhaustion and defeat. How long did you plan this, Thatcher? How long were you sitting at my table, eating my food, while you were sharpening the knife? I wasn't sharpening a knife, Mother. I was writing a curriculum. You told me I was a waste of resources. I simply decided to prove that I was the most efficient resource in this family. You should be proud. Your son is a master of the very system you used to suppress him. She didn't answer. She just looked back down at the papers, her hands trembling slightly. She was a surgeon who had lost her hands, a queen who had lost her court. I felt a brief flicker of the old sarcasm, a desire to make one final, biting comment. But I suppressed it. The silence was more devastating. I left her there, a ghost in a house that no longer belonged to her. As I walked out of the house for the last time, I saw Bobby Finch being escorted from his office building by two men in suits. It was on the news feed of my phone. The forensic audit I'd triggered had uncovered the offshore accounts, and the board of directors was moving for a full civil suit. He wasn't going to jail, not yet, but his life as a power player was over. He would spend the rest of his years in depositions and legal hearings, a slow, grinding professional erosion that would strip him of every luxury he had stolen. I reached my car and threw my backpack into the passenger seat. My laptop, my journals, and a single folder of my original, unadulterated research were all I was taking with me. The rest, the bitterness, the shadows, the Reed name, was being left behind in the ruins. I drove toward the highway, the city skyline shrinking in the distance. The morning sun was bright, reflecting off the glass towers like 1,000 shards of a broken mirror. I felt a strange, buoyant lightness. The hunt was over, and the prey had been neutralized without a single drop of physical violence. It was a victory of logic, of patience, and of a superior intellect finally allowed to breathe. I pulled over at a rest stop 50 miles outside the city. I took my burner phone, the one I had used to orchestrate the chaos, and looked at the screen one last time. There were dozens of missed calls, hundreds of frantic messages from Daniel, Clara, and Bobby. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I knew the tone of their desperation. I walked to a trash receptacle near the edge of a wooded area. I felt a surge of triumphant energy as I dropped the phone into the bin. I then took my notebook, the one with the crossed-out names, and tore out the pages. I watched as the wind caught the paper, scattering the remnants of my revenge into the trees. I was no longer Thatcher Reed, the underestimated graduate student. I was a man with a clean slate and a significant trust fund, heading toward a university on the other side of the country where no one knew my name or my history. I had my research, I had my mind, and I had the absolute certainty that I would never be small again. The internal commentary that had sustained me through the dark days was finally quiet. There was no need for sarcasm when you had achieved total clarity. I looked back at the road, the long gray ribbon of the interstate stretching out toward a horizon that was no longer a cage. The fallout in the city would continue for months. The lawsuits, the scandals, and the professional collapses would provide gossip for the elite for years to come. Lennox would try to rebuild, but she would find that the doors she had spent a lifetime opening were now permanently sealed. Daniel and Clara would drift into the obscurity they deserved, forever haunted by the memory of the man they thought they could break. I climbed back into my car and shifted into gear. The engine purred, a smooth, powerful sound that mirrored my own internal state. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The walls had closed in, the floor had dropped out, and the only person left standing was the one they had never truly seen coming. As I merged into the flow of traffic, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of malice or of lingering anger. It was the smile of a man who had finally solved the most difficult equation of his life. The answer wasn't found in the books or the labs. It was found in the realization that the only person who could define my value was me. The sun was high in the sky now, washing the world in a brilliant, unforgiving light. I turned on the radio, found a station playing something upbeat and driving, and pressed the accelerator. I was gone, a phantom of the city's past, heading toward a future that I had built with my own hands. Piece by piece, secret by secret. The story was over. The revenge was complete, and for Thatcher Reed, the real life was just beginning. I watched the miles click by on the odometer, each one a step further from the person I used to be. I was a traveler now, a man with no baggage and a destination that was mine alone to choose. The air coming through the window was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. I breathed it in deeply, feeling the oxygen fill my lungs with a purity I hadn't felt in years. I was free, not because my enemies were ruined, but because I had stopped letting them live in my head. I had evicted them from my mind just as surely as I had evicted Lennox from her office. The space they had occupied was now filled with a quiet, powerful confidence. The road ahead was open, the sky was vast, and I was finally, truly in control.